Welcome everyone to another community class here on the Green Art channel. I post these every single Friday with some other fun stuff sprinkled in throughout the month. So if you haven't subscribed, please do that now. You'll get a little ding every time a new class comes out. This week I'm excited to talk about the link between specific plants and specific deities, gods and goddesses in different bits of myth and folklore, and why plants are always showing up in our mythologies, right? And here in a minute, I'm going to tell you a few little stories, right, about some specific deities, some stories that I think are cool. But I want to start with sort of just this general overarching idea of why is it that we see plants and deities connected so often, right? There isn't a deity out there who doesn't have a plant that's sacred to them, or doesn't have mythology or folklore wrapped up in a particular tree or a particular plant, right? It's impossible to find any deity anywhere, any god or goddess, or even sometimes heroic and deified ancestral figures who don't have plant lore wrapped up in their own lore. So why is that? The main thing to consider is that plants have areas of influence, right? This is part of their virtues. This is part of the magic and the medicine that they bring into our world. Their area of influence talks about the things they're interested in, the things they're good at, the types of energies or patterns or vibrations that happen in the world that that plant has some kind of affinity for. So for example, when we talk about plants that have an affinity for abundance or creating wealth, right? That idea, that concept of enoughness, of abundance, is in their wheelhouse. It's in their realm of influence. And that's an interesting way to think about it, because we also think about the deities the same way, right? We think about the god of war, or the goddess of protection, or the goddess of the hearth, or the god of forests, right? That we're talking about them in terms of where their primary area of interest is, or where they have the most influence, or what aspects of life they tend to want to be the most involved in. It doesn't mean that that's the only place where they have power, or the only interest they have. You know, they're multifaceted people just like you and I, but that it's their primary profession, right? It's their primary area of interest. So what tends to happen when we see plants connected with deities is that the area of influence of the plant and the area of influence of the deity have overlap. So it's not a shocker, for example, to see Aphrodite, who we've kind of pigeonholed a little bit into being the goddess of love, also having connections to roses, a plant that has an obvious connection to love, right? So that's one way of looking at it. Another way is that sometimes particular plants are worked into the mythology, or they're part of the lore of a particular god or goddess with no obvious connection, but because that plant plays such an important role in that deity's story, in their pastime, in their narrative, then there's a link there. And so when we have these plants that have a shared area of overlap, or for whatever reason have been brought into or play a role in the mythology, we can work with that plant as a way to connect more directly to that particular goddess or god, right? We will see that in the lore, particular plants might be smoldered in an incense in order to invoke or evoke that deity, or that particular plants are made as offerings to that deity, because when the presence of the plant is there, there's a deeper, stronger link between the devotee and the deity themselves, right? Sometimes we see when a particular flower blooms, or when a particular tree flowers or something, that relates to the time of year that is sacred to that particular deity, right? So there's all these really interesting connections in folklore. So when we work with particular plant spirits, we will be in the domain of their virtues, but it also implies, because animism, because the world is a web of infinite relationships, that we'll be in the domain of other people too. And so when somebody has a really deep connection to a plant, I always say, you should also explore in the folklore and the mythology of various traditions if there are any gods and goddesses that also have a deep link to that plant. It doesn't mean that you're going to dedicate or devote to that deity, but it means that you can maybe learn a different angle of the lore, or you can learn a story about the plant through the eyes of a particular culture or through the story of a particular deity. And maybe there's an interesting link between you and the deity, and you can end up working together, right? That's also something that's very cool. One thing that I really like to remember in all of this is that for folks who do any kind of deity work or ancestral work or whatever, we can bring the plants in as part of that devotional process. Again, working with the plants as bridges, as doorways to get closer to that deity, understanding that when we connect to a specific plant that has a connection to a deity, we are strengthening the connection. We're sort of multiplying the different avenues of relevance that we have as we step into a relationship with that deity. So it's interesting. And this also, by the way, spills over into work with ancestors, right? That if you have a great grandmother who had a particularly deep personal connection to violets, in your work with that ancestor, you should bring in violets because that connection is already there, it's established, and it strengthens your connection vicariously, right? So part of, in the deeper green mysteries, when we get into the mystery aspects of plant spirit work, which go beyond the scope of this particular class, we will see that the way that plants show up for particular deities, the way that they show up in particular rituals, show up because of the way they open paths, right? Because of the way they strengthen cords and connections between an individual person, a community, a collective, whatever. That can sometimes be one of the hidden secrets of why a particular plant or tree comes into mythology. So let's now have some examples. I want to give you a couple of my favorites from the perspective of virtue, right? Just how particular plants and particular deities sort of have the same area of influence. And then I'm going to tell you maybe 2 or 3 particular deities where it's the mythology, it's how a plant shows up in folklore that's most meaningful. So the first goddess that I want to talk about is Demeter, or Demeter, right? Her name translates to the mother, Demeter. And her sacred plants tend to be cereal crops, grains, those foods that act as staples for people, that keep us alive during the winter, that are made into bread and drink and are the sustaining crops of the people. And of course, as a grain goddess, as an earth mother figure, as a crop goddess, it makes sense that she has a connection to these cereal grains. So when you look at the iconography of Demeter, even many of the extant statues that exist of her, she will be holding, a bundle of some kind of grain, some kind of cereal crop, to show that her connection to those plants, there's an overlap of virtue, of nourishing, of supplying nourishment, of providing, of the wealth of the earth, right? Both of those types of plants speak that same virtue, so it's very interesting. I also think of Dionysus and grapes, right? That he is, of course, known as the god of wine, or a god who has a particular vested interest in the mysteries of wine and the process of fermentation and in the ritual of intoxication, right? But that it all begins with the vine. It all begins with the grape, and so much mystery there of the vines climbing and spiraling upwards and then creating this fruit that easily ferments and is turned into an alcoholic beverage that can be used, for socializing, but also for ritual purposes. And so the energy of grape and the way that grape shows up as this viney plant of, that's so wrapped up in wine lore in many, many traditions, also has an affinity with the things that Dionysus is interested in as well. So there's a link between those two plants. When we bring grapes into our ritual practices with Dionysus, the ways become more open. Another one would be Deus Pater, Zeus, Jupiter, all of these different iterations of the Indo-European god Zeus, oak, right? And oak, we know, is oftentimes the strongest wood, the tallest tree, represents strength and fortitude, order, justice. These are all things that Zeus also stands for, right? King of the gods, sky god, the deity who looks down over things and sees the patterns of things, that is kind of the gatekeeper god that decides how things happen and when they happen and who they happen for. So there's a natural connection between oak and Zeus. Very interesting. So there's some like virtue examples, right? Where the virtue of the plant and the virtue of the deity, what they do, how they show up, what their interests are, their magic and their medicine have some dovetailing, some overlap. But we also, again, have those stories where maybe the connection isn't so obvious, but the plant still shows up in lore. And one of my favorite examples of this is Attis, right? And Attis is, of course, very deeply connected in the lore to the pine tree. And this comes because, and even though Attis really is a spring god, right, having him connected to an evergreen doesn't make a ton of sense. Usually our evergreen deities are the deities of the forest, or they're the deities of healing or of long life or those mysteries. Attis is a springtime god, and we know that in the stories, his love, his adoration, his obsession with Cybele, right, was so intense that in a state of ritual frenzy, he castrated himself underneath a pine tree. Now, there's got to be some link there, right, between releasing your vitality under a tree that is evergreen, that always holds vitality. There's very much a contrast and a polarity in the mysteries of Attis, the Cybelean and Attis mysteries, right, which we'll save for maybe another time. But because of this, all of the rituals around Attis have something to do with pine. When it's time for him to die at the end of the growing season, again, because he's a spring and rebirth god, we see a pine brought out from the sacred forest. The branches are stripped away. The pine is dressed in funeral wrapping as though it was the god himself, and sometimes an image of him is affixed to the pine, and that pine is carried to the temple of Cybele, where it is entombed so that he can rest at the feet of his beloved goddess, only to wake up again and be showered in the flowers of violet in the springtime. So no obvious connection through virtues, right? But pine shows up in the lore, so when folks work with Attis, pine is always there. Pine is always part of this. I also think about the Greek nymph Mintha, right? This is such a cool one because the etymology is there as well. Mintha, of course, was a nymph who, caught the attention of Hades, and Persephone didn't super like that. And so part of the way Persephone handled that situation was turning Mentha into a plant. And if you guessed that the plant that Mentha was turned into was Mentha, mint, you're right. So is there any virtue connection between mint and the wandering eye, or between mint and placating an unrequited lover, or a lover who is jealous? Not that I know of. But in this particular story, Persephone, in her wisdom and in the pastime of their mysteries, decided to turn Mintha into this specific plant, which we now call Mentha, or mint, after the goddess, right? So again, no virtue connection, but the plants show up together with the deities in lore, and so there is a connection, to the extent that, like so many deities, the plant mint is actually seen to be an embodiment of the nymph Mentha, right? They're one and the same person. Last one we'll talk about is Odin, or Woden. Of course, hung himself on the world tree for 9 nights, sacrificing himself to see through into the mystery of things, into the weirdness of life. And that tree, in most accounts, is the ash tree. So now the tree that is sacred to Odin, or Odin's tree, is the ash. When we look at ash symbolism, ash medicine, and Woden as a person, there's not a lot of really obvious virtue overlap, but this is the tree that he chose to hang himself from. This is the tree that in that culture stood for the world tree. right? Or the dominant tree, or the tree that represented the way of the universe, because the tree always shows us how the cosmos works, right? We talk about that all the time. So here are a few examples. So if you do any kind of deity work, there's a really profound invitation to consider the plants that are linked to that deity, to contemplate why. Do they come from virtue overlap, or do they come from mythology? And then to get really creative about how you bring those plant spirits into your work with the deity, how the plant spirits then can become part of the collective of work. That rather than saying, I work specifically with the goddess Hecate, right? Which is fine. We can also consider how the spirits of Belladonna and Datura and Poppy could be brought in as supporting deities or supporting spirits to that work, because they open up the pathway because of their connection to her. So this is very interesting. If you have any kind of overlap between specific deities that you work with and the plants that are connected to them, I would love to hear about it. Inspire all of us. Share in the comments below. With that, I will send you out with blessings of peace and plenty. I'll see you next time.